So hello everyone and welcome to the latest in the series of Big Think webinars for international school leaders, school owners and school groups. We're delighted you've joined us in what we hope will be a useful, informative and inspiring session that's all about thinking big about the future of international education. For those of you who have joined previous Big Thinks, you'll know the score by now. But if you're joining us for the first time today, firstly, welcome. I'm Susie Williams of the International Schools team at Pearson, and I will introduce you to today's speakers shortly. But before we get started, I'd just like to draw your attention to the chat and the Q&A boxes. I can see that lots of you have already found the chat, but if you have any technical questions as we go along, please do pop those in the chat and we'll aim to resolve those for you as soon as we can. And please use the Q&A box to submit any questions you have on today's topic. I know some of you have submitted questions in advance, so thank you for those. There will be time at the end of the webinar for discussion, and we'll aim to get through as many of those questions as we can. Finally, to help us understand a little bit more about you all here today, we have a quick poll which will be appearing on your screens now. And in it, we'd like you to please tell us what sort of international school or group you're representing here today and what your role is. So I'll just give you about 30 seconds to complete those two questions for us, and then we will proceed. So you should be able to see the poll on your screens now. Okay, so it looks like 40% of you are joining us from an international school offering a British curriculum, 13% an international school offering an IB curriculum, 3% offering a US curriculum, and let's have a look. There's a real mix of school groups, owners and others, and 27% of you are principals or head of school. And then the next biggest group is 23% of you members of the teaching team. You are all very welcome here today. We are delighted that you have joined us. So thanks for that. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for today's webinar, Elizabeth Moore and Jessica Yarbrough. Elizabeth is Vice President of Learning Research and Design at Pearson. Her work involves developing and applying evidence-based frameworks and resources to support employability and lifelong learning outcomes. She's passionate about integrating opportunities for learners to develop, practice and demonstrate personal, social and emotional capabilities to support their success in school, work and life. And Jessica Yarbrough is a senior research scientist in skills research within Pearson Learning Research and Design team. Jessica uses empirical studies and existing research to support the development of knowledge and skills frameworks within Pearson products. Welcome, Elizabeth and Jessica, and over to you.
Thank you, Susie, and hello to everyone and welcome. So we presented with the Big Think a couple of months ago, and we discussed current trends that are changing the nature of work and what impact those trends will have on the skills that learners need to succeed in the workplace of the future. In that presentation, we focused primarily on the human skills like critical thinking and problem solving, creativity, communication, and collaboration. And these are the skills that are going to be so important when we think about trends in automation and technology and increasing remote work. There are other changes that are going on and that we anticipate that we will see in the workplace of the future that are going to have implications for the needs for employees to consistently reskill and upskill. And today we're going to be talking about the skills that will help prepare learners for that aspect of the workplace of the future. So first, and there we go. I did want to start off with a poll just to get everyone thinking. So this statistic comes from the World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report. What percentage of current employees will need reskilling in the next 5 years? Or in other words, what percentage of employees will need to learn new skills for their jobs within the next 5 years? Okay, so actually, everyone was thinking it was a little bit more frequent than what the study found. So this particular study said that the employees or employers surveyed thought that about half of the current employees would need reskilling within the next 5 years, which is a pretty high number. And the reason that we are seeing employers think more about reskilling and upskilling is because the way that we do work is really changing. So obviously the COVID-19 pandemic has caused very massive and immediate disruption and change to the workforce or the workplace. But we've also seen ongoing advances in technology and automation and a rise in globalization, which are causing more gradual but nonetheless really substantial changes. And one of the implications of these events and trends is that the work that we do and how we do work is expected to change. The core skills that employees need for their jobs are expected to change over smaller and smaller timeframes. And experts anticipate that we're going to see many new jobs emerge and enter the economy. And these are jobs that we don't even know what skills they will require. So as a result, there's going to be a greater need for workers to learn while they're on the job and to learn later in life. It wasn't that long ago that you did most of your learning in formal education, you entered one job, and then did basically the same job or the same type of work for your entire working career. And we really just don't expect that to be the case moving forward. Fortunately, there are skills that we can teach learners during formal education that are going to help prepare them to thrive in this workplace of the future where change is really a constant and learning is expected. We're going to focus on two sets of skills today. The first is resilience, stress tolerance, and flexibility, which will help learners cope with and manage a changing or uncertain workplace. And secondly, we're going to talk about active learning and learning to learn, which helps learners to take responsibility for their own learning, both while they're in school as employees who are expected to learn while on the job. And we also know that these skills are currently recognized as important by employers, as you can see from the results that are on the slide. So this again is that World Economic Forum Future of Jobs Report 2020, and 2 of the top 10 skills for 2025 that were identified in this report are the 2 skills we're going to be talking about today, and those are highlighted on the slide here. So now I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth to discuss that first skill.
Hi, everybody. As Jessica mentioned a little bit ago, we presented, I've lost track of when it was, but it was another Big Think a month or more ago. I don't know if there are some people on this call now who were in that session. But like Jessica said, that session was really focused on what school leaders and instructors can do to support development of those soft skills like critical thinking, collaboration, communication. And in that session, we talked really about, making the most of those opportunities in curriculum to have group work, research studies, project-based learning, making things not so, a single right answer, right? Building in opportunities for students to explore, defend their thinking, not just reach a single conclusion. So there's some other skills that are in that report that I think of as sitting almost on top of those. And it has to do with this resilience, stress tolerance, and flexibility, right? These are the skills that are going to help our students now just weather the disruption and change that we know from all the studies is in front of them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience. There are many, many ways to describe this. It could be its own session. And I think we've all seen during the pandemic, maybe an article a week somewhere on how being resilient, is key to sort of making it through all of the challenges of pandemic life. So Jessica and I picked a few ways I think are important to sort of think about these if you want to unpack resilience. So first is self-awareness, right? One aspect of resilience is, does someone even know if they are resilient? Do they know they have areas of growth? Do they engage in self-reflection about what went well, what could be improved? Another aspect is around self-control, regulating behaviors and emotions, using strategies to focus on getting work done over something that's more immediately gratifying, like a distraction, some alternative. You actually, develop that kind of self-control to put away the immediate gratification to stay focused.
We hear a lot about is growth mindset. I don't think that'll be a surprise to anyone on this call. So understanding and really believing that talents and abilities are not fixed and that they can grow and develop. Persistence is another aspect. Sometimes you hear the word grit associated with this, right? You keep working at something difficult despite setbacks or difficulties, right? You don't just give up. And then finally, to that last piece on flexibility, some say, adaptability, flexibility, approaching setbacks and obstacles with sort of an open-mindedness and a problem-solving attitude, having some strategies to preserve that growth mindset, right, that we talked about a little bit ago. So I'm going to give these are not as, I would say, when we talk about supporting the other soft skills in an educational setting, we have tons of very concrete, practical suggestions. These are a bit, I'm not going to say they're not practical, but they're not as like tangible, have your teachers encourage teachers to have this kind of instructional practice. So just bear with me, because I think the best way as school leaders and teachers, you can encourage students to develop these other less tangible skills around resilience and adaptability and flexibility. Two ways that I'm going to talk about. One is psychological safety, and the other is sort of in your positions of influence modeling. So this is, and I'd love to hear, I'm going to ask you in a minute to be thinking about what I say so you can add some additional information in the chat. But psychological safety, I think, as everyone knows, is, creating that environment where students feel safe in expressing ideas, expressing opinions, right? They truly believe they will not be humiliated, they will not be teased if they admit to a mistake, if they share a reflection, no matter how sort of wonky it sounds, if they offer an idea, they ask a question. In order for that to happen, there needs to be a culture of valuing active listening, treating feedback as a positive, right? We deal with this as in the workplace too, right? That feedback is, if you're getting feedback, you assume you've done something wrong. And so the trick is to switch that, is like feedback's actually a good thing. It's not a judgment on what you've done. And I think, whatever you can do to treat asking questions and admitting mistakes as positives, right? Like these are things we actually encourage and celebrate because they show that you're willing to receive feedback and practice those other things we just talked about in terms of self-awareness, growth mindset. So the most impactful way, I think, going back to the poll that Susie did, your school leaders and your teachers, right? You are in a position of both influence and authority. So you also have this power sitting with you to model what it looks like to be resilient, right? We all model good behaviors all the time as leaders, right? With students, we model being respectful, model being intellectually curious. So what I would offer up for consideration is, what does it look like to model resilience? How do you deal with adversity? How do you sort of think out loud so your learners sort of see what it looks like for an adult to be saying something like, oh, I made a mistake and I realized I made a mistake. And then, here's like what I thought about how I could correct that, or being a little vulnerable, sharing reflections, either in the classroom or at a school assembly. Any sort of thinking out loud that shows how you personally have dealt with something that was a setback or an obstacle. Just don't underestimate the power of the position you're in and the opportunity you have to encourage students and learners to think of these things as positives. I'm going to stop there, Jessica. I could go on about this all day, but I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica.
Thanks. Yeah, these are just such deep topics that you could spend so much time talking about. But I will move on because I do want to cover the second skill we were going to talk about today, which I'm referring to as learning to learn, but it goes by a few different names. You might have heard it referred to as independent learning or active learning or self-regulated learning. And what we're really referring to here is helping learners take a thoughtful and active role in anticipating, planning, and really engaging with learning activities. I think that many learners think of learning as a very passive process. It's something they experience or that just kind of happens to them. And teaching this skill involves helping learners to see the internal workings of the learning process and understand that there are ways that they can take an active role, that they have autonomy to choose how they learn or how they study. Learning to learn also involves knowing that different learning strategies exist or that there are different ways that they could approach learning or studying or trying to master a certain concept. And then knowing that some of those strategies are more effective and are more likely to help them achieve their goals and being able to select those strategies. Then lastly, this skill involves being very reflective about previous learning experiences. So after you've completed a study session or a learning activity, reflecting back on what went well and what didn't, and seeing how that reflection can be used to adapt to do better in the future. In order to support learning to learn for our students, it's really important that students are given time and space to talk about and reflect on the learning process. And you can think about how this could happen during 3 periods. You can think about it before, during, and after learning. We want to communicate that it's maybe not ideal to just jump into a learning activity. We should pause and think about what's the best way to approach it. While students are learning, we can help them really actively monitor how well it's going. And then afterwards, we can help learners holistically consider how everything works together and anticipate what they should do the same next time and what they should do differently. When we think about how we can do this in specific classroom practices, there are many opportunities to leverage or adapt the classroom or lecture structure to really scaffold this skill. So many of you or many of your teachers probably have a specific structure or format in mind for how you design and implement lessons. So one thing that can be useful for teachers to do is to think about how you can insert questions into that existing structure to prompt learning to learn, or are there natural places to pause or natural checkpoints? And if you do that exercise and you find that that's not really the case, you can think about how you could adapt the structure so that it offers more opportunities for these types of checkpoints. And then once you've identified those points in the lesson or points in the lecture, there are several questions or prompts that you could provide. So before engaging in learning, you can ask learners to think through things like, what do I want to learn during this session? What do I already know about the topic? And then once I'm done, how will I actually know that I've learned what I wanted to? And then afterwards, you can prompt them to think about, what did I learn? What went well? Things like that. Then it's also important to specifically teach effective learning strategies. So we know from the research that strategies like practicing recalling information from memory, trying to explain new information to yourself, and spacing out practice is more effective than just rereading lecture notes or studying in one large chunk right before a test. And explicitly teaching these strategies can be really important because it's going to give learners a language to think and talk about learning strategies. I think a lot of learners don't just naturally think of strategies for learning. They don't have that language. So teaching it and helping them become familiar and develop that language is one really important first step. Then you as the teacher can model or demonstrate the learning strategies. And then afterwards, once you have this shared set of learning strategies and the language to talk about them, you can prompt learners to ask themselves and self-identify what strategies they're using and what strategies they find more or less effective. And I wanted to go through a few of those learning strategies that I mentioned that we know from the science are effective and just give a little bit more info on those. So the first one is self-explanation. And this involves using prior knowledge to explain new material to yourself. And it's a way of really consolidating new information while you're studying with what you already know. So that promotes deeper learning. So one specific example of this could be in a lot of science classes, you'll oftentimes in the textbook, you have a cycle or a process, something like the water cycle, for example, where you've got the image and then maybe some text boxes that describe each of the steps. So learners could review it, study it, and then when it comes time to study and see how well they know, they could take the image, cover up the text, and then just try to describe the process and how something that happens in one step leads to the next step without the words there, just from the picture. And then they can remove what's hiding the text and see how well they got, if there was any pieces of information they were missing. That would be an example of kind of this self-explanation. Some other things that you can prompt or teach to learners is have them, when they're exposed to a new concept, explain and identify how that relates to what you already know about the topic. You can also prompt them to describe how they know some fact or concept is true. This can be particularly useful in math, for example, where you've got a lot of theorems or proofs that learners can kind of think through and describe why that is the case. This next one is similar to our kind of discussion about the water cycle or process, but when learners are presented with a demonstration or a simulation or description, they can infer and sort of describe what do they expect to happen next. Then lastly, learners can explain how one step in the problem-solving process contributes to, for example, a solution as a whole. So how do you get from that particular step to a broader solution? Next, I'll talk about this idea of practice testing. And so we know that to strengthen memory for a fact or a concept, it's better to try to recall it from memory rather than just rereading or otherwise reviewing it. I think a lot of learners, their idea of studying is just, I'm going to reread my textbook or my lecture notes over and over and over again, and that's going to help me remember it. And what we know is that that's not the most effective way. Instead of doing that, it's better to quiz yourself and try to recall the information from memory. And then obviously, after you do that, review the correct information so you can see, oh, I remembered these parts of the concepts, but this is something that I didn't remember, and that strengthens that learning process. We know that it's also more useful when we can do practice testing that involves recall as opposed to recognition. So it's better for learners to try to answer open-ended or free response prompts about a topic rather than multiple choice questions. So if you're giving learners review questions, a lot of times those more open-ended review questions are going to be more useful than multiple choice. And then lastly, it can be useful to vary kind of the testing conditions. So where you're engaging in the practice testing, so doing it maybe at school and at home, maybe different rooms within the home if learners are still learning online, as well as question phrasing or order. So just having, say, 3 questions that you just continually go through is not as ideal as having multiple questions that you swap around the order. So just the variety there, again, kind of helps that memory to stick. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about spaced practice, so that when you're doing practice testing and you're repeatedly doing it, it's more helpful to space those repetitions out over time. So again, I know, and this kind of gets into the time management space, because a lot of times learners will sort of try to cram and have one single study session right before a test. But we just know that's not the most effective way to study. It's better to kind of walk it out for days or even weeks before a test or sometime that they'll have to demonstrate their knowledge, and do spaced out bits of practice. So every couple of days, for example, quizzing yourself on something rather than relying on that single large study session. As you think about spaced practice, it's also important that as learners start to master, or really understand a concept to gradually increase the time between tests or checks on that concept. So this just helps learners to, when they know something, not to waste time rehashing it, but to still check in on it enough that you interrupt that tendency to forget. And then lastly, if you're covering multiple groups or types of concepts, so for example, different types of math operations, it's useful to study across content areas instead of massing your practice on one topic at a time. So let's say in math class, a learner is having to learn addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division operations. It's better for them just to space out practice that includes types of questions on all 4 of the operations, as opposed to saying, I'm going to focus on addition right now, and I'm going to just do addition until I really understand it and then move on. So it's good to have that variety, which again just helps to consolidate the learning and helps learners perform and master and really understand these concepts. So that wraps up what we wanted to speak about today. We'll have some time for Q&A, but I want to leave us sort of with a parting thought, just that, when we think about kind of what the experts are saying about employability and the workplace of the future, we really see change as a certainty, and we might not even know what types of jobs the future will bring, which can be concerning because we want to prepare our learners for those jobs and to be successful in the future. But we do know the types of skills and mindsets that are going to give our learners an advantage kind of regardless of what those changes are and what that specific workplace of the future looks like. And there's a really big opportunity for us to find ways to be intentional about equipping and giving learners these skills that we know are going to help them regardless of what these changes bring. So yeah, well, thanks to everyone. Hope this was interesting and that you found some useful tidbits. I think we have some time now for Q&A.
We do. Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Elizabeth. As mentioned, if you have some questions, if they've just struck you now, please do find the Q&A box and type them in for us. And I'll get us started with a couple of the pre-submitted questions that we received as delegates registered for the webinar. So there's 2 related questions from Dingjanglu Phaiga of the English and Foreign Languages University in India, who asks, what is the best way to integrate 21st century skills in our teaching? And linked to that, Rana Khan, principal of SPAN International Academy in India, asks, how do we introduce 21st century skills into our online pedagogy? So yeah, question about how do you integrate that into teaching, whether that be online or face-to-face.
Yeah, thank you, Susie, and thanks for those questions if you all are on the call. So I would point folks back to our first session, I believe in March, for just more specifics, because this is something that we could talk about really at length. But a few highlights are, in terms of teaching these skills, I think it's important to look for opportunities where learners are would need to use those skills. So Elizabeth mentioned quite a few of those early on, where learners have to work together in group or collaborative projects, where learners have to communicate their ideas, where learners have to research something or explore something that is very open-ended and then have to justify their opinion or the conclusion that they came to. And then also where learners have to plan and think about how they're going to structure their learning or go about working on an activity. So finding those activities that come up in your curriculum or in your pedagogy, and then use those as opportunities to label and communicate to learners that when they're doing that, perhaps let's say in a science course, they're learning the science topic, but they're also learning one of these 21st century skills, and building in opportunities to label and talk about the skills, and maybe even give feedback on how well the students are demonstrating the skills in those activities. And then when we think about transitioning to kind of online pedagogy, I think there's actually maybe even more opportunities to talk about those skills, because in online learning, a lot of things need to be more explicit. there needs to be more structure because it's something new and unfamiliar to perhaps the learners or even the teacher. So when we think about doing online group projects, you can be even more specific about how this is an opportunity for collaboration. Here are the strategies for collaborating. Here are the different, presenting with different ways to engage or work with each other online, and how you can think about which are going to be most effective for what we're doing. There's a really interesting strategy that you can use if you're worried about in online learning, the students just sort of dividing up and focusing on their own little bit and not working together. It's called the jigsaw strategy, where you can separate learners into groups, and each of the different groups become an expert in one concept or topic that they're going to need for the project. And then you shuffle them into new groups where each learner becomes the representative for their concept in the new mixed expertise group. And then the new group really has to work together because only one person has each piece of knowledge that they need. So they have to share and really work together.
Thanks, Jessica. That sounds fascinating. Jessica was referring just then to the previous webinar that she and Elizabeth ran for us. If you didn't manage to catch that webinar, do go to the Big Think webpage where you'll find the recording to that session. It was the webinar in March, so you'll find details of the recording there. The next question that we had in work, before we turn to some other live questions, was from Priyanka Modi, who asks, how do we deal with the fact that schools are not yet ready to teach life skills? We're still obsessing over curriculum and marks. And I think all of us can appreciate the situation that you are all in at the moment. So that's a very pertinent and timely question.
I'll take this one. I referenced this at the beginning. I think it's a struggle everywhere, right? You have the curriculum that you're required to teach. There are high-stake accountability measures in place in terms of marks and grades and test scores. And then there's this opposing, like, yes, but you have to prepare the students for everything else in the world, right? Manners, soft skills, resumes, how to just do everything. But I would say for me, and in sort of the school improvement space where I've worked, like really rolling up to the curriculum level, right? Because it has to be at the curriculum level and at the classroom level. But taking the curriculum you have to teach, the required, scope and sequence, and just really intentionally looking for those opportunities where there's a way to reach the objectives of the standards, but through group work, through research projects, to field study, project-based learning. So it's sort of, it's not undermining the curriculum in any way, but there's like direct instruction, and then there's an opportunity for students to really explore. And it's not going to be fit for purpose for everything, but it's sort of a curriculum level review, I think, of where are the best opportunities across all subjects, not just the science ones, to flip something to put the inquiry of the learning back in the, back on the learners. And it's not an easy thing, and I think it's probably what everyone's already doing anyway, but just really intentionally going through a curriculum and going, okay, what in here can I make more open-ended, more inquiry-based, more project-based, is the way to balance out the other task of, you have to teach the curriculum, there have to be grades, but it de-emphasizes that a little bit to put it back on the learners, and you still will get the grades and you still will teach the curriculum.
Brilliant. Thanks, Elizabeth. Linked to that, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box that I'm going to link together. So apologies if that's not the right thing to do, but I think it probably is. So the first question here is, how can I motivate my students to self-study? And the second, I think probably related question is from another delegate saying, most of my students are troublemakers. How can I change their attitude? So yeah, I think linking those two together and a bit more about the sort of the independent learning, the self-study, and how to motivate that skill within students would be great.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll take a first pass and then Elizabeth, if you want to add anything. So with the caveat that these are very challenging problems. So it's not like there's a single strategy that would perfectly solve it. But I think a couple of things that you can attempt and try. One is to figure out ways to give learners choice and autonomy in learning. We just know that when folks, and these are children or adults or anyone, feel like they have some say or control in what they do, they're usually going to be more motivated. And sometimes that means not giving them any choice, but maybe choice between two things are important, as opposed to maybe the choice they would make, which would be not to study at all. But trying to find those places where learners can have autonomy and choice. And then another is trying to think about making connections between learning and things that students value. And that's going to be really different for each individual student. But I think a little bit of exploration, even for students that maybe are really unengaged or unmotivated, you can find the thing that you can make that connection between. If you work hard and really work on this topic, it's going to help you get to what you ultimately want to do. So those are just two strategies that come to mind to try there.
Now, I'll add one quick thing to what Jessica said, is that a lot of times we find that that self-study is like a single concept. It's just like, it's overwhelming for, if you said like, okay, go to your room and do your homework as a parent, like my kid for a while, like didn't know how to start doing the homework, right? Like, couldn't sort of unpack, like, what does that look like? So just again, back to the modeling or talking through like, okay, what's the first thing you need to do? Like make a list or review your agenda or make sure you have all your materials together. So we're used to scaffolding learning, right? Introducing a concept, like making sure that learners know enough and activating prior knowledge so that they're like ready to receive the next wave of information. But I think that we sometimes underestimate how much support students need that would be really obvious to older learners or adults. And sometimes as an older learner, you assume knows how to do these things, but they've just never had the opportunity to go, okay, I don't even know what self-study looks like. I don't even know how to start, which then is going to make them switch off, which may also lead to your troublemakers. I don't know. It's not always a one-to-one, but I think having taught a lot of troublemakers that the defensive position is to be a troublemaker because you've switched off in everything else because it was all a bit, you didn't have the confidence to do it. So the other option was to cause trouble. More fun sometimes.
A question here from Zeba Clark. How do we measure or assess resilience? That's a good one.
It's such a good one. I'm going to look to Jessica.
Yeah. Well, one useful tool, and I think there's probably a lot of these tools that are free for educators to use online, are having students kind of self-reflect. So there's a lot of questionnaires out there that have items that are pretty specific that describe what being resilient would look like. And you can have learners kind of go through and identify which ones they think are very true for them, as well as which ones are less true. And so that can give you an idea of maybe where they see themselves possessing some of those resilient skills and then where are particular areas of growth for them. This does not work with every part of resilience, but I think you can, because resilience is such an internal process, there are some ways that you can kind of prompt learners to describe what they're doing. So I think with persistence, this would be the case, or maybe adaptability and flexibility. If learners are in a situation where that would be required, kind of getting them to say, okay, what was I doing that helped me to persist? Or if it was really hard and I felt like I didn't persist in this activity, or I wasn't particularly resilient, kind of having them think through that process and identify maybe what was the primary struggle, what got you off track, which again can give you insight into the strategies they're possibly using to be resilient and identify those barriers or things that they might need to problem solve around to help be more resilient.
Wonderful, thank you. Now we've got just a couple of minutes left, so we've got 1 minute left for a question. I'm going to just approach the most recent, the earliest one that's come in, so I'm doing it fairly. Could you please give us some interesting ideas of how to adapt future skills for use in early years?
You want to go first, Jessica? You want me to go?
Yeah, you go first on this one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm thinking of some of, it's true that a lot of times people think critical thinking, is sort of for middle years and secondary, but Jessica and I would strongly advocate that critical thinking begin very, very early. And I think the single cross-cutting strategy is in the appropriate language to just be describing what it is you're doing, right? So you might not say collaboration for early year learners, but you might say, okay, well, we're working in a group. Jessica just said something, the thing you just did, you added to what Jessica said. So that's a really important thing to do when people are trying to work together. So as a classroom teacher, using any opportunity to label something like a bit specifically, that's the thing you just did. You explained to me why you thought that. That's really important. That's a really good thing to do. We call that critical thinking. You may not want to say that. I don't know how early years are, but I would focus on starting to give early year students the language or the ability to recognize that the thing they're doing is a skill. They're not just working well with others. They're adding to an idea or not interrupting or, what's age appropriate, but let them know that's a skill that they're developing, not just being nice or being respectful. Jessica, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think that's great. I would just add a couple of other, I think, really foundational things for younger learners are asking questions, just kind of exploring things, being able to say what they think and give a reason why. And then for more of the social skills, just that perspective taking, recognizing that other people are out there and they have different experiences and maybe react to different things than I do. That's just very foundational. So those are just some specific things that I think are pretty developmentally appropriate, but form the foundation for some of these skills.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Right, I'll have to call it quits on the questions there. And so all remains for me to say is thank you, Elizabeth and Jessica, and to everyone who has joined us today. Certificates of attendance and a link to the recording of this webinar will be sent to you by email tomorrow. And I will just give a quick plug for the Big Think webpage, where you can find recordings of all 6 Big Think webinars so far, including this one, and find out what's coming up next in the series. Now, on that note, we're taking a short break in July and August as you all hopefully get some downtime after results days and recharge a little for the new academic year. We'll be back in September, though, with more Big Thinks, where our diverse topics will include making a success of early years education, flipped classrooms for dynamic student-centered learning, and lots more. So details of these webinars will be online soon, so please do look out for them. And we'll be sending out a short survey soon to everyone who has attended a Big Think to get your feedback on the series and to see if there are any topics that you, our wonderful Big Think audience, would like to get involved with presenting as part of the series. So if you're an expert in an area that you'd like to share, look out for that email coming into your inboxes in the next few weeks. I do hope you can join us for the next Big Think in September. So thank you again and have a great rest of the week. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.